these men, again, black men, who have embraced a word that's primarily geared toward your generation and young white men like you, Jason, because you are the primary consumption of this music.
Exactly right.
So if, in fact, that's the reality, that to me is a layer that critically needs to be teased back. You know, there is something historically also where black people, and I'll use this relative to W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks, he calls something double consciousness. It's the way in which black people who have been treated horribly in this country, both past and present, can internalize stereotypes and negativity about themselves. Women and girls can do that relative to patriarchal ideas also. We somehow respect white people more than we do people who look like us as black people. Women who will be harder on other women and girls than they are on men because they somehow see men as the authority. So there are ways in which we internalize that. And if we want to take this even further into this term of endearment, I just draw your attention to the ways in which owners of people who were slaves thought of their slaves endearingly. In fact, they referred to them as, how's my N-word today? And you'd have somebody like Frederick Douglass saying, oh, I'm fine, massa, I'm fine. So we treat pets endearingly. So the fact that this is if it's like friend, if it's like brother, why are we not using that? That is not laced with all the violence that is still laced with it today. So if we could somehow take that and put that past on the shelf and say that black people in this particular case are not treated unfairly, there's not educational inequities, achievement gaps, et cetera, then we could somehow say, well, yes, we've moved past that and we've taken something back. But I use the word of Toni Morrison, the author, who says, definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. And there's nothing in the history that I'm aware of that says black people gave that to themselves. And I know what Kendrick Lamar has said about NEGUS. Kendrick Lamar is probably the only person who subscribes to that theory, and even that theory is patriarchal. It does not take into account women and girls. And Tupac has an acronym for it that probably two people on the planet can recite. But that is not how that young man on the baseball team used it, nor is it how other people use it when they're angry and upset with other people, whether they're black or white.
Right.
So that, to me, there's no history like that with the B word. There's no history like that with the F word. There's no history like that with the P word. There's no history like that with any other word. So if it's like friend, if it's like brother, then why are we not using that?
So explain to me, what I'm interested in is the deeper history of the word, because being in high school, last year especially, my history class was called American Studies, and we learned about the Civil War and we learned about the Civil Rights Movement, and obviously the word played a very big role in both, but the way that we were taught it was in a kind of like it was stepped around. Our school, I think, is very uncomfortable teaching us about things of that manner. I think that the class would have been uncomfortable anyway. I don't think that our class had a level of maturity to handle it, first of all. But the thing that I see as a high schooler is the word is almost viewed at as an inappropriate subject. And it is in just about every setting. But I still think that it's worth talking about in the classroom, because people like me, I don't understand the history all the way to its roots, because we were never offered the opportunity to learn about it.
They probably blurred out the signs during the civil rights marches that said anything like that, because that's typically what we would get in our classes. The blur. So we really don't feel the real effect of the history of it. So, and I've actually heard a lot of baseball players and say, well, maybe we need to educate more. Maybe instead of suspending people in professional sports for using it, we teach them, we educate them. It can't just be an excuse for the 20-something-year-olds that, it's ignorance then. So,
well, but it doesn't have to be an either or, though. I think if there are going to be consequences, and I would look at this in the context of some other legal cases, a couple that I'm aware of, one at Alabama State, and there's another one in New York, and then another one in actually Hackensack, New Jersey, where it was black-on-black use of the word. One walked up to a person and said, oh, hey, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm the head, N-word. And the other person, who was African-American, was offended by that.
Mm-hmm.
As would I be offended by that when somebody walks up. And I want to move this beyond personal offense, though. But I'm bothered by that when somebody assumes that they can name me something that is not my name. So this is not just a black-white thing. This is also a black-black thing. The NAACP, for example, has tried to bury it symbolically. That can't work because it lives in our very American fabric. We've also had campaigns to get rid of the N-word. So there are ways in which the history needs to be discussed, but it also is one of those things when you say we haven't discussed it, that I'm wondering who the we are, because there are black people that I know have had to talk about race and have had to talk about the N-word because their young kids came home being called that. So the people who haven't had to talk about it are the people who have the privilege of not talking about race.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't use that as an across-the-board way of saying we are just, should we have the conversation? We should always be having conversations. What, to me, complicates this is the fact that the hip-hop that allegedly is driving people to say stuff over which they have no control, apparently, that it's also laced with misogyny.
Yes.
It's also laced with homophobia. So are these messages being absorbed also? That's what I ask. And for those teachers who, I found the other part of this is that white teachers tend to fetishize the word. So if we're teaching Huckleberry Finn or if we're teaching...
That's exactly what it was for us last year.
To Kill a Mockingbird, they make the whole text about that. And that seems reductive, and it also seems unfair to the authors and those who are really engaged in literary study. So it is a word. It is a word that symbolizes and signifies so much more than the 6 letters. But if we go back to minstrel song, Jason, if we go back to slave narratives, if we go back to, historical documents that show that the spelling of that word is consistent with what people claim they've taken back and changed it. And think about this. The root of that word is the same. So whether you spell it with a G-A or a G-E-R, it is the same. And in fact, in 2012, when then President Obama was going to be reelected, one of the T-shirts and decals read 2012, don't R-E-N-I-G. And so that wasn't necessarily a misspelling of renege. It was a play on the N-word. So that hasn't changed. So when people are talking about spelling and choreography, the gendered way in which people are trying to hold on to this, then to me it's much deeper. And I'll say it's very similar to those who were enslaved often talked about how, who had the better master. Well, that's a very pathetic conversation to have if you're both being owned. And I think when we talk about this being used as a term of endearment, I'd also say that it's not just restricted to sort of intergenerational difference, because I know a lot of high school students who are doing spoken word pieces who are talking specifically about language and who are using the N-word to say this is not something that we should be defined by relative to just because some people who are making a lot of money, Jay-Z, on using this word in rap because it signifies a certain cool factor to those who don't see themselves as cool.
Dr. Lester, one of the teammates in the White Sox clubhouse, who is white, a pitcher, Lucas Giolito, told theathletic.com, quote, given Timmy's circumstances, who he is, how he grew up, I think that the word he said and the context that he said it isn't the same as someone else saying it. So that's pretty much my view on it. Again, agreeing that nothing should have happened from it. But what I hear from coaches is they are really conflicted on how to handle it because some people tell them you're supposed to give a player a pass for using it because of where he grew up. Others want to instill discipline and smarter thinking and think before you do things. And this is all part of it. Think before you say something. So there's a lot of confusion on that part from coaches and those around sports as well as to how to handle it.
Well, but I would still go back to if you're considering your baseball field and the game as a workplace, then you decide what language and what behavior will be tolerated and that which will not be tolerated. What they say outside of the baseball field and that space is up to them. But if you have certain rules and policies about your workplace, then I don't think it should be relegated to where one comes from, because habits that one absorbs can be good habits or bad habits, and what we learn, we can also unlearn.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I'm not sure that that's a reason for confusion either. And keep in mind, my guess is this is probably mostly white people who are confused.
Yeah, right.
So that we have to name that.
Right.
We have to name that and not sort of by default make it, we have to figure out what the race is, because my guess, Jason, I don't know, are you in a predominantly white school?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
I grew up in the suburbs. Yeah, okay. So I grew up in the suburbs. In fact, in my middle school, I think that we had one black student. So my middle school was all white. And then I get to high school, and I believe it's about 60.
It's about 40. Yeah, 60% white.
But there's a lot more diversity than middle school, for sure.
Well, but the point again is that these are predominantly white spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So predominantly white spaces would be very fragile when it comes to talking about race.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the reality is that white people need to start talking about race and understanding the extent to which it affects everybody. And this is certainly a start, but it's one of those things where, and even the black people who are in those spaces don't always understand either. And part of that is because, people don't stop and Google this, and people don't, we sort of absorb what is easiest and fastest for us to absorb.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've been one of those who have been trying to do the work. I've created the class, taught on it, lectured on it, doing interviews on it. And I'm essentially saying the same thing, but it's the same way in which I'm encouraging those who are allies, those white allies, those straight allies, those able-bodied allies, to take up the cause of those who are out there doing the work to try to educate, so that we all become part of our own education and not just relying on others. So I said all that to say there's a responsibility that teachers have to go into uncomfortable places as long as they are appropriately equipped themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If they haven't self-assessed their own attitudes about race, then they can't go in and shouldn't be trusted to go in and talk about it. On the other hand, I wouldn't rely entirely on someone of color to quote-unquote educate you, not you, but educate anybody solely based on one person's perspective. So I challenge any of my audiences, anybody who's reading the stuff that I'm doing, to go look at what I've thrown out there and check it out. Check it out to see if it makes sense to you.
Absolutely.
So
it's the Project Humanities initiative at Arizona State University. Dr. Lester, finally, let me just ask you this. Why is it that the F word over time has lost its power? And now I know it's because it describes an act as opposed to being used in a horribly hateful, degrading, insulting way, like the N word. But the F word has lost power over the last 30 years. Will that ever happen with the N word? Will it ever become where it's just a word that doesn't offend people?
Well, those are apples and oranges, because the N-word is about an identity. The F-word is not about an identity.
Mm-hmm.
And the identity of the people most associated with that, who have been used negatively, the reality of their existence has not changed significantly. So the N-word is not about how one is treated. It's not about one's age. It's not about one's sexual identity. It's not about anything except the fact that this can be used as a toxic nuclear bomb. So there are ways in which, I am the first one, I study language, who looks at the way in which black people in particular have taken words and done all kinds of incredible things with it. Michael Jackson did it with, made bad good.
Mm-hmm.
We can change fat, F-A-T, to make it P-H-A-T. We can take ableist words like stupid and make that a good word. But those are not individuals. Those are not human identities. Those are adjectives. This word, the N-word, has been used as an adjective. It can be used as an adverb. It can be used as all kinds of things. And these are about identities that have still been fixed in the American imagination, politically, historically, socially. So to compare the F word And I would even say the B word doesn't have the same historical baggage either.
Right.
That's gendered. The N